Stopping showing up isn't about being cold or playing games. It's about recognizing where your effort stopped being matched. When you quietly step back, the space you leave behind speaks louder than any confrontation. His ego doesn't crash because you disappear, but because the consistency he relied on is suddenly gone. Your consistency often becomes invisible, not because it lacks value, but because it has always been there, showing up repeatedly, emotionally, mentally, and physically, creates a sense of stability that can quietly turn into entitlement. When someone knows you will always respond, always care, always adjust, the effort you bring stops being noticed and starts being expected. The ego settles into comfort, not appreciation. It assumes your presence is guaranteed, not chosen. Consistency is powerful, but only when it is reciprocated. When it isn't, it becomes the cushion that allows someone else to be careless. They don't worry about losing you because your reliability has taught them they don't have to. Your messages, your patience, your willingness to understand, all of it becomes the background noise of their emotional life. The ego relaxes into this security, believing it has nothing to lose. The moment you stop showing up, that illusion collapses. The comfort that was once taken for granted is suddenly missing. The ego doesn't crash because of drama or confrontation, but because something essential has been removed. The stability you provided is no longer there to absorb inconsistency, neglect, or half-effort. Silence replaces reassurance. Absence replaces availability. And in that space, reality becomes unavoidable. When your consistency disappears, it forces comparison. The ego begins to measure the present against the past. The warmth that once existed, the ease of access, the emotional support. All of it becomes visible only in its absence. This is when realization hits hardest, because appreciation often arrives late. Not when something is freely given, but when it is no longer available. Stopping your consistency also reveals the imbalance that was hidden. When you were always there, the connection seemed functional. Once you pull back, it becomes clear how much depended on your effort alone. The ego feels exposed by this realization. It has to confront the fact that the connection wasn't sustained by mutual care, but by your willingness to keep showing up even when it wasn't returned. This shift is unsettling because it removes predictability. The ego relies on patterns. It feels safe when it knows what to expect. Your consistency created a pattern that required no effort from the other side. When that pattern breaks, uncertainty enters. The ego starts questioning where it stands, what changed, and why the dynamic no longer feels secure. That uncertainty is uncomfortable because it signals loss of control. Importantly, stopping showing up is not an act of punishment. It is a response to imbalance. You are not withdrawing to provoke guilt or regret. You are withdrawing because your energy is valuable and finite. This distinction matters because it changes the emotional tone of your absence. It is calm, grounded, and final rather than reactive or emotional. That calmness makes the impact stronger. Internally, this decision restores self-respect. You stop pouring into a space that no longer values your presence. You begin to redirect your energy toward yourself, your growth, and relationships that meet you halfway. This internal shift strengthens you. You become less reactive, less dependent on validation, and more aligned with your worth. The ego struggles with this because it cannot argue with consistency being removed. There is no accusation to defend against, no argument to win. There is only the realization that something it relied on is gone, and because it was taken for granted, it wasn't protected. Ultimately, your consistency was never a weakness. It was a gift. When you stop offering it freely where it isn't valued, the ego crashes not out of spite, but out of loss. And in choosing not to show up where you are no longer respected, you reclaim the power that was always yours. Absence has a way of revealing truths that presence often conceals. When you are consistently there, filling gaps, smoothing over tension and maintaining connection, it can mask how much emotional work you are actually doing. The relationship appears balanced because you are compensating for what is missing. The moment you stop showing up, that compensation ends, and the reality of who was carrying the emotional weight becomes unmistakably clear. Emotional work includes initiating conversations, checking in, offering reassurance, managing misunderstandings, and sustaining emotional closeness. When one person does most of this work, the connection survives, but it does so unevenly. The other person may not consciously recognize this imbalance because they are benefiting from it. The ego settles into comfort, assuming that emotional stability is simply how things are, rather than something being actively created by your effort. When you pull back, the silence becomes instructive. Conversations slow, connection weakens. Moments that once felt natural now require effort. This shift exposes how much of the emotional structure was built and maintained by you. The ego feels the loss not as punishment, but as disorientation. The familiar rhythm is gone, and with it, the ease that came from not having to contribute equally. This absence also removes distraction. When you are present and over-functioning emotionally, the focus stays on interaction rather than reflection. Pulling back forces the other person to sit with the space you've left behind. There is no emotional cushion to soften the impact of neglect or inconsistency. The ego is left alone with the consequences of its inattention, and that solitude often leads to awareness. Stopping showing up also clarifies intent. Without your effort sustaining the connection, the other person must decide whether they will step forward or drift away. This decision reveals more than any conversation could. If they reach out with genuine effort, it signals a willingness to share emotional responsibility. If they remain passive or resentful, it confirms reliance rather than reciprocity. Either outcome brings clarity, and clarity is empowering because it replaces uncertainty with truth. For the ego, this clarity can be uncomfortable. It highlights dependence on your emotional labor while challenging the self-image of independence or control. The realization that the connection functioned largely because of your effort can feel destabilizing. It reframes the dynamic, revealing that what was once taken for granted was, in fact, essential. Internally, pulling back from emotional work creates space. You are no longer expending energy managing someone else's emotions or maintaining a connection that lacks balance. This space allows you to reconnect with your own needs, desires, and boundaries. You begin to notice how much lighter you feel when you are no longer responsible for carrying both sides of the relationship. This internal shift often strengthens your resolve to maintain healthier dynamics moving forward. Absence also changes perception. When you are always available, your effort blends into the background. When you step away, your contribution becomes visible through its absence. The ego begins to recognize what it lost not because you demanded recognition, but because the void makes it undeniable. This recognition is often delayed but lasting, as it is rooted in experience rather than argument. Importantly, stopping showing up does not require confrontation. There is no need to explain or justify your withdrawal. The absence itself communicates the message. It says that your effort is not automatic, your energy is not unlimited, and connection requires mutual participation. This quiet assertion of value is difficult for the ego to dismiss or recover from. In the end, absence exposes the truth because it removes the illusion of balance. It reveals who was doing the emotional work and who was benefiting from it. And in that revelation, the ego is forced to confront a reality it can no longer ignore, while you step into a clearer, more self-respecting version of yourself. Silence has a way of amplifying what was once ignored. When you are present, available, and responsive, your voice blends into the rhythm of everyday interaction. Thoughts are shared, feelings are expressed, and moments pass quickly. But when you stop showing up, the quiet that replaces your presence creates space. And in that space, the mind begins to wander. What once felt optional suddenly feels missing. The ego, which thrives on immediacy and distraction, is forced to sit with the gaps it previously dismissed. When you were there, your words may not have been fully heard, your efforts not fully felt. Familiarity can dull awareness. Silence reverses that. Without new messages, explanations, or emotional input, the mind fills in the blanks on its own. Conversations replay, moments resurface. Things once brushed aside gain weight. Silence doesn't argue or accuse, it simply allows memory and imagination to do the work. This is why it is so powerful. The ego is particularly unsettled by silence because it removes feedback. Feedback confirms relevance. Even frustration or disappointment can reassure the ego that it still matters. Silence offers no such confirmation. It leaves the ego alone with unanswered questions. Did I misjudge? Did I take something for granted? Why does this feel different now? These questions echo because there is no external distraction to silence them. Silence also removes control over the narrative. When you speak, your words can be challenged, dismissed, or reframed. When you are silent, there is nothing to counter. The ego can no longer steer the conversation or redirect responsibility. It must confront its own thoughts without interference. This internal dialogue is often more confronting than any external confrontation could be. Stopping showing up shifts the focus inward. The absence of your presence forces awareness of what you contributed. Emotional availability, consistency, warmth, these things become noticeable only when they are gone. The ego begins to understand the value of what it once had, not because it was told, but because it is now missing. This realization tends to linger because it is self-generated, not imposed. Silence also slows time. Without constant interaction, moments stretch. Waiting replaces immediacy. The ego, accustomed to instant reassurance or response, feels unsettled by this delay. The lack of resolution keeps thoughts looping. This is not manipulation. It is a natural psychological response to absence. The mind seeks closure, and silence withholds it. Internally, silence restores your equilibrium. You are no longer reacting, explaining, or trying to be understood. Your energy returns to you. This calm withdrawal creates emotional distance that allows you to see the dynamic more clearly. You begin to recognize patterns you once overlooked because you were too involved. This clarity strengthens your resolve and reduces the temptation to re-engage prematurely. For the ego, this clarity on your side is deeply destabilizing. It senses the shift even without words. There is a subtle awareness that the old dynamic no longer applies. Attempts to provoke a response may arise, but silence neutralizes them. Without reaction, there is no leverage. The ego is left confronting its own discomfort rather than managing yours. Silence forces accountability without accusation. There is no argument to deflect, no emotion to dismiss. The absence simply exists, and in that existence, responsibility becomes harder to avoid. The ego must reckon with the reality that something meaningful has changed. Ultimately, silence does the work words could not. It fills the gaps with reflection, magnifies what was ignored, and leaves the ego to grapple with the consequences of absence. While you reclaim your peace, the quiet continues to speak, steadily, persistently, long after your presence has been withdrawn. No reaction is one of the most destabilizing experiences for an ego that thrives on influence and control. When someone expects a predictable response, anger, pleading, justification, or even guilt, the dynamic becomes a cycle in which power is continually negotiated. The moment you stop reacting, you remove the very mechanism the ego relied upon to feel in control. The absence of a predictable emotional response leaves the other person unmoored, unsure of how to proceed, and forced to confront the reality of the situation without your participation. The ego often interprets reactions as engagement, proof that it still matters and that influence is intact. Arguments, emotional outbursts, and attempts to provoke a response provide confirmation that the connection is alive and that control exists. By refusing to react, you remove that confirmation. The silence and calm that replace reaction are not passive, they are deliberate. They communicate authority, self-respect, and emotional independence. The other person begins to realize that they no longer have leverage over your feelings or behavior. Choosing not to react requires self-awareness and restraint. It's not about ignoring feelings or suppressing emotions. It's about responding intentionally rather than automatically. Instead of feeding the cycle with explanations, defenses, or justifications, you observe, step back, and allow the situation to exist without adding emotional energy to it. This kind of composure signals that you are grounded, centered, and not reliant on their validation or engagement for your emotional state. The impact of non-reaction is subtle but profound. The absence of predictable emotional cues forces the other person to fill the space themselves. They may replay interactions in their mind, question their behavior, or recognize patterns they previously ignored. Because there is no confrontation, no blame, and no drama, the ego cannot dismiss the experience as a simple argument or momentary frustration. The realization arrives quietly but unmistakably. Your energy, attention, and presence were choices, and now they have been withdrawn without spectacle. Non-reaction also changes the power dynamic without aggression. When you respond emotionally, you inadvertently give the other person a role in controlling your state. When you stop reacting, that control is reclaimed. You become the steady center of your emotional world. Your choices dictate engagement, timing, and presence. This shift is not about winning or teaching a lesson. It's about refusing to let your energy be dictated by someone else's ego. Internally, refusing to react protects your well-being. It prevents you from being drained by cycles of argument, manipulation, or provocation. It allows you to maintain clarity and emotional balance. Instead of being swept into someone else's turbulence, you remain grounded, making decisions from alignment with your values rather than out of impulse or frustration. This calm authority is noticeable, even without words, and it signals that the relationship dynamic has changed fundamentally. The ego struggles in this environment because it cannot operate in isolation. It relies on external cues to assert dominance or influence. When those cues are withheld, the ego experiences uncertainty and discomfort. Without visible responses, there is no victory, no defense, no opportunity to negotiate control. The loss is internal, subtle, and persistent, leaving the ego destabilized in ways that words alone cannot achieve. No reaction also allows the truth of the dynamic to emerge. Without emotional interference, the situation exists as it is, uncolored by argument or over-explanation. The absence of reaction lets reality speak for itself, exposing imbalances, dependencies, and neglected responsibilities. The other person must confront the impact of their actions, not through your words, but through the quiet consistency of your choices. Ultimately, refusing to react is a powerful act of self-respect and emotional sovereignty. It removes control from the other person, protects your peace, and forces accountability without confrontation. The ego cannot recover easily because it has lost the mechanism it relied on to maintain influence, leaving you firmly in command of your presence, your energy, and your life. Withdrawing is often misunderstood as punishment, but it is not about teaching a lesson or seeking revenge. It is about asserting self-respect. When you stop showing up, you are making a conscious decision to protect your energy and prioritize your worth. Your attention, your time, and your emotional investment are valuable, and choosing not to extend them to someone who has taken them for granted is a profound act of personal empowerment. The ego, which relies on access to your presence and emotional availability, is left destabilized because the very thing it depended on is no longer freely offered. Many dynamics persist because one person continually overgives, compensating for imbalance and carrying the weight of connection alone. When this effort is withdrawn, the illusion of stability dissolves. The other person may initially experience confusion, frustration, or even anger, but these reactions do not define the withdrawal. What defines it is the quiet clarity with which it is executed, an absence of drama, explanation, or provocation. By choosing not to engage unnecessarily, you allow reality to surface without emotional distortion. The ego struggles with this because it thrives on influence and predictability. It assumes that your presence and attention are constants, tools it can manipulate or take for granted. By removing yourself calmly, you disrupt that expectation. There is no outburst to redirect, no apology to provoke, and no dialogue to argue over. The absence alone communicates your value and signals that your energy is not limitless. In that quiet, the ego begins to feel a loss it cannot negotiate around. Choosing to withdraw is also about reclaiming internal authority. When you continually overextend emotionally or physically, you cede control over your energy and attention. By stopping, you regain it. You decide when and how to engage, if at all. This reclamation is empowering because it transforms your energy from something reactive to something deliberate. It shifts the dynamic from one where your presence can be assumed to one where it is recognized as intentional and valuable. Internally, the act of withdrawal is liberating. You are no longer caught in the endless cycle of explaining, justifying, or compensating. Your emotional bandwidth is returned to you, allowing reflection, clarity, and growth. Without the constant drain of unreciprocated effort, you can redirect focus to yourself, your priorities, and relationships that honor mutual respect. This internal shift is palpable and often evident to the other person, even without overt communication. Withdrawal without drama communicates firmness and integrity. You are not withdrawing to manipulate or punish. You are withdrawing because you respect yourself enough not to expend energy where it is undervalued. That distinction is crucial because it removes the opportunity for the ego to dismiss your actions as emotional or reactive. The absence is steady, calm, and intentional, a clear reflection of your self-worth. The impact of this choice is amplified because it leaves space for reflection. The other person is forced to confront the consequences of their behavior and the reality of their reliance on your energy. Without your presence to smooth over inconsistencies or provide emotional support, they must face what was previously ignored. This confrontation is often uncomfortable because it is silent, lacks blame, and offers no shortcuts to avoid accountability. Ultimately, withdrawing is not an act of cruelty but of empowerment. It reasserts boundaries, communicates value, and forces recognition without words or drama. The ego cannot recover easily because the source it depended upon is gone, and there is nothing to fight, manipulate, or negotiate. In this quiet withdrawal, you reclaim your space, your energy, and your authority, demonstrating that the most powerful lessons are not taught through confrontation, but through self-respecting action. Choosing yourself quietly is the ultimate act of self-respect and empowerment because it removes the ego's access to the very thing it relied upon. Your presence, attention, and effort are not commodities to be assumed or taken for granted. They are expressions of your value. When you step back without drama, you demonstrate that your energy has limits and that your well-being is non-negotiable. This quiet assertion of self-worth is far more powerful than confrontation because it communicates strength without aggression, leaving the ego unable to recover or manipulate the situation. The act of choosing yourself is often invisible on the surface, yet it resonates deeply. Many people mistake withdrawal for punishment, but it is not about revenge or trying to elicit guilt. It is about reclaiming authority over your life and your emotional resources. By making your presence conditional on alignment, respect, and mutual effort, You create boundaries that are firm but not hostile. This distinction makes your choice subtle yet devastatingly effective. The ego struggles because it cannot argue with absence that is rooted in self-respect rather than emotion. When you consistently showed up, the dynamic likely relied on your energy more than their own. Your care, attention, and emotional labor kept the connection alive. By quietly withdrawing, you reveal the imbalance that was masked by your presence. Suddenly, the other person is faced with the reality of what they depended on: your consistency, patience, and commitment. The ego experiences this not as a lecture or a confrontation, but as undeniable absence, which is far more difficult to dismiss or rationalize. Choosing yourself also restores your emotional autonomy. When you stop over-functioning, you reclaim energy that was previously allocated to managing someone else's feelings or maintaining their comfort. This space allows reflection, clarity, and growth. You begin to see the relationship dynamics for what they truly are, rather than how you hoped they might be. This internal shift strengthens resolve, enhances self-confidence, and reduces the likelihood of returning to imbalanced patterns. The power of quiet self-choice lies in its subtlety. There is no drama, no emotional explosion, no attempt to manipulate or shame. The absence itself communicates the message. Your presence is not automatic, your energy is not infinite, and respect is non-negotiable. The ego cannot twist or reinterpret this kind of withdrawal because it is not reactionary. It is deliberate, consistent, and grounded in self-worth. The impact is lasting because it is based on truth, not theatrics. Internally, choosing yourself quietly fosters a sense of power over your emotional world. You are no longer subject to the highs and lows dictated by someone else's behavior. You make decisions based on alignment and self-respect, rather than fear, guilt, or hope for change. This independence is felt even if it is not overtly acknowledged. Others sense the difference in energy, the boundary of availability, and the refusal to be taken for granted. The ego struggles to recover because access has been removed. It cannot leverage reaction, produce guilt, or manipulate emotion because the source is no longer participating in the dynamic. Absence, grounded in self-choice, is absolute. The consequences are unavoidable, yet the withdrawal is serene and composed. This combination of firmness and calmness is what makes quiet self-choice so profoundly effective. Choosing yourself quietly is a declaration of your worth without requiring conflict or explanation. It communicates that your presence is intentional, your energy is valuable, and your boundaries are unshakable. The ego crashes not because you attacked it, but because the access it depended on is gone, leaving the reality of loss in its place. In stepping back with calm authority, you reclaim power, clarity, and emotional freedom, demonstrating that true strength is not loud or reactive. It is quiet, deliberate, and unassailable. Stopping showing up is not about punishment or games. It's about reclaiming your power and honoring your worth. When you quietly withdraw your presence, remove emotional labor, stay calm, refuse to react, and choose yourself, the dynamic shifts completely. His ego crashes not from confrontation, but from the absence of what it relied upon. In that stillness, clarity emerges, imbalance is exposed, and self-respect becomes undeniable.